What's up, WHAP? We're talking Unit 4 today. We're talking about the age of exploration, some stuff that we actually wrote an essay on during the year, and I'm hoping that you guys are pretty well versed in it. In general, when we go over this time period, which of course is 1450 to 1750, we've got these five themes. We've got a lot of themes, a lot of things that go on in this time period, and a lot of things especially that focus on Europe changing. Europe is, as we talked about in our last lecture, going through a change in government. They went from feudalism to these nation states under absolute monarchs. And we talked, for instance, about France when we talked about the Bourbon dynasty with Louis the 13th and Louis the 14th. With England, we have the Stuart family that are starting to rule over and control England with Charles the First and Charles the Second, etc. And then, of course, in Russia, we have our czars over there. And when these different countries become united under one government and they have one tax collection system with bureaucrats, etc., we see that these governments become a lot more wealthy and a lot more well organized. And with this, we see that starting with Portugal, these European states are going to sponsor explorers. They're going to pay for explorers to go out and look for a quicker way to the wonderful goods in Asia. And in doing so, obviously going to find new lands along Western Africa, in the Indian Ocean, and then, of course, the Americas. And so the nation states becoming centralized under these absolute monarchs and revolutionizing and adapting and evolving their tax systems and bureaucracies, et cetera, is only going to encourage the age of exploration. And that, of course, is going to lead right into our interaction of Europe, Africa, and America. We'll see the Columbian Exchange as a result. We'll also see syncretic cultures and religions. But we will see the triangular trade created in the Atlantic Ocean, which, of course, is going to start the Atlantic slave trade. This is also the defining time of our first era of colonization. We have two major eras in colonization. The first is in this time period, 1450 to 1750, where we're going to see colonization in the Americas, in South Asia, which of course is India, and that'll largely be the British, and then Southeast Asia, and that'll be the Portuguese, followed by the Dutch in the Indian Ocean. Why are they colonizing in this period? Why is Europe colonizing? They are especially motivated by the belief in mercantilism. We also see the development of joint stock companies in this time period. We don't yet have industrialization. Industrialization, when we talk about mechanization, the creation and mass production of goods in factories, when we do see industrialization, that will bring about this second era of colonization. We haven't done that yet. We are in our first era of colonization that comes with the age of exploration, and that's where we start today's lecture. So here we are, the age of exploration. The big picture for the unit is that we have these new technologies, especially the caravel, this new ship that is going to allow us to explore the oceans. And now, with these new centralized monarchs that have money at their disposal, that have power and influence over their peoples, we are going to see this period of age, this age of exploration. Why are we exploring at all? We are looking for a quicker way to Asia. We have to go through two different groups of Islamic middlemen in this stage. We have to go through the Ottoman Empire, for one. The Ottoman Empire is controlling the Mediterranean Sea until they lose the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. And so when we see Columbus, of course, in 1492, one of the biggest reasons why is we don't want to have to pay these really inflated prices for goods from Asia that we're getting from the Ottoman Empire. We'd rather try and directly trade with Asia ourselves. The other Islamic group is the Kingdom of Oman, which we have lots of rivalries with Europeans, especially the Portuguese, competing with merchants from that Kingdom of Oman. This is called the Omani European rivalry. But because we have these desires for all these wonderful goods from Asia, the silks, the spices, We are now going to attempt to round Africa to get into the Indian Ocean. Of course, the Portuguese are going to be the first to do this. They'll develop trading post empires. The Dutch will follow them. Of course, the other thing that will happen as a result is the Spanish will discover the New World with Christopher Columbus. What are the effects of this age of exploration in general? We have high levels of immigration to the New Worlds. We have a development of new cash crop agriculture, largely based off of new labor systems like indentured servitude and then later chattel slavery. And of course, we have cross-cultural interactions. We have syncretism. We have the Columbian Exchange. Okay, so we're talking about those goods from Asia, silk and spices and tea and medicine and sugar. Up until this point, we did not have the technology to round the Cape of Good Hope. We had all of those wonderful Chinese inventions, like the lateen sail, like the knowledge of the monsoon winds, and that helped people sail within the Indian Ocean. But the difficulty was coming all the way from Europe around West Africa. This was an impossible task until the development of the caravel, because this is deep sea ocean traveling, and that led to shipwrecks. And without these big, strong caravels, these three-masted ships, it would be impossible to make it around the Cape of Good Hope, around Africa. And for centuries then, because of this, because of location, the Ottoman Empire and then the Kingdom of Oman really dominated the trade of these goods, this silk, the spices and the tea, to European merchants. The middlemen, of course, were our Muslim merchants. And because of this, we have this desire to make it into the Indian Ocean. This was our classic technology developed before 1450. The stern runner, the astrolabe, the magnetic compass, the lateen sail, all of these things helped that trade in the Indian Ocean. And Europeans didn't develop any of these things. They only got them from especially Muslim merchants. One of the places where Western Europe got access to these technologies is Al-Andalus, which was one of our Muslim caliphates in modern day Spain. When we have all of these Muslims here using these technologies, Western Europe is going to get these technologies and then improve on these technologies. And again, the biggest is the Portuguese ship, the caravel. It has these three masts. It has allowed sailors to travel in the deep ocean travels and survive even when you have those big storms at sea. There's also different technological innovations that are going to help our Europeans in this time period, one of which is Newton's discovery of gravitation, which then helped predict the tides. And no one will have a low tide, we'll have a high tide. Obviously, with a low tide, the rocks in the harbors are more pronounced, and therefore ships can shipwreck in these harbors. And so knowledge that the tides will change is going to allow us to travel into uncharted territories. Cartography is map making, new and improved map making, especially of West Africa's coast. Okay, so the three names, the three proper nouns of Portuguese expansion are these three gentlemen. First of all, Prince Henry the Navigator. This guy is probably the most important out of all three, because this is our first European monarch that's going to say, I'm going to spend the taxpayer money on paying for explorers to try and find a new way over to Asia, over through the Indian Ocean. And Prince Henry the Navigator is going to start sponsoring these expeditions. And one of our first successful explorers that are sailing for Portugal is Bartholomew Diaz. Bartholomew Diaz, as you can see from the orange arrow here, is going to go from the capital, Lisbon in Portugal, West Europe, and he's going to go along West Africa's coast. And he's going to actually be the first to round the Cape of Good Hope. But as he rounds it, his crew starts to get more and more afraid that if they continue, they're going to shipwreck. And the crew is almost about to mutiny unless Bartholomew Diaz turns around. He does so. But Vasco da Gama, 10 years later, is going to be the first to round that Cape of Good Hope and then make his way all the way over to India. And he's actually going to stop many times along his way to India. First, he's going to stop in West Africa and start to build forts there that become Portuguese forts controlling West African slave trade. Later, he's going to make his way into Eastern Africa here and establish forts there, and then establishing a fort in India. So Vasco da Gama, not only the first to round the Cape of Good Hope successfully and make his way into the Indian Ocean, also formed several forts that are going to be the start of the Portuguese trading post empire. And here is that Portuguese trading post empire. The Portuguese are the first to make it into the Indian Ocean, and they have all of these forts. And really, the big difference when you look at the Portuguese empire at this stage is that the mass majority of colonies are really just forts. They are trading posts in which they regulate trade by taxing the trade that goes through there. They are not looking to stay and colonize and interact with the locals. They're looking to regulate trade, and they're looking for converts to Christianity. When you look at, for instance, the Spanish over in the Americas, they are looking to stay, and they are looking to intermarry with the natives, and they are looking to control the large amounts of lands in the Americas, not what's going on with the Portuguese. The Portuguese are looking to derive wealth through monetary gain, and, of course, introduce Christianity. And if you look at the map, the only place where they've really gained sizable lands is in West Africa, the Swahili coast over here, and then, of course, Brazil, which is a very, very different situation. The Americas are based off of plantation agriculture. This Indian Ocean trade routes is based off of taxation, right? Taxing all trade in these areas. And because the Portuguese are the first to come in and gain so much wealth from taxing in the Indian Ocean and for developing these maritime empires, they are going to make the other Western European states very, very jealous. And of course, the biggest being the Spanish. The Spanish, of course, with King Ferdinand, Queen Isabella will send Christopher Columbus. The Portuguese trading post empire, to finish up with this, we have forts in the Swahili states of Eastern Africa, Hormuz, which is over here in the Middle East, Goa in India, and then, of course, Malacca, the Malaccan Strait down here. All of these different forts, they are going to regulate trade by forcing every merchant that trades through there to have a license, or else face the punishment of being sunk by the Portuguese ships. Therefore, they can tax and regulate all trade, and they forbid any ship from carrying spices. The Portuguese created a demand and a monopoly on spices. And so because of this, especially in the 16th century, which of course is the 1500s, the Portuguese dominated trade in the Indian Ocean. But this is what's going to create these rivalries for colonies. Different European states, such as the Spanish, want to gain from their new lands like the Portuguese did, because having new lands is going to bring all sorts of new riches. By controlling these lands, you can have the access to spices, gold, silver, etc. You're also going to be able to tax all of the trade in these lands and then enforce converts to the state's religion. The Spanish and the Portuguese were largely Catholic, so were the French. The English and the Dutch were largely Protestants, and so all of which are Christian countries, although after our Protestant Reformation, we have different denominations of Christianity. All right, so why would you be an explorer? Why would you go off and travel to these new lands, travel to the New World, for instance? That seems like a very, very dangerous thing to do. Sea travel is very dangerous. And then, of course, you could meet some hostile natives. And many of these explorers did meet their ends, their deaths to the natives. So why go and risk it? Why go and sail away from the home state? Well, there's three major reasons why explorers, what we call push factors, why these people left their home state and went somewhere else. One of which is rising population. There was not enough work or food in the home states, and therefore people that didn't have a lot of wealth or a lot of access to land were motivated. They were pushed to go and search for a place where there was available land or was available work. And one of the things that kind of goes hand in hand with the fact that there wasn't enough work or food is primogeniture laws. And primogeniture laws going all throughout Western Europe. And of course, primogeniture laws are when the oldest son, and only the oldest son, is going to inherit all of the land and wealth from the family. And everybody else, the second sons, the third sons, the fourth sons, and all the daughters, were not going to inherit anything. And because of this, you saw a lot of second son explorers, meaning a lot of people that didn't have any ties to inheritance that were going off to search for new lands or trying their luck in already discovered lands over in the New World. And in that, we also see separatists, especially religious separatists, especially after the Protestant Reformation in Europe. We have lots of people that want to practice their newfound religion or escape a place where they are not tolerated in their state. And because of this, we see many separatists coming over to the Americas for the first time. For instance, our New England Puritans are in fact Calvinists, and they're coming over to escape a very Anglican England, and they're looking over to establish a Calvinist society in New England. Also, of course, we're looking to avoid competition from those Islamic merchants, especially, as I mentioned, the Kingdom of Oman, which is over here competing in the Indian Ocean. All right, so you've heard of him, Christopher Columbus. He is actually an Italian explorer. Of course, he sails for Spain. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand have centralized their power in Spain. There's no better example when discussing the age of exploration, how important the centralizing of power under absolute monarchs is to the age of exploration than Spain. In 1492, these two monarchs are going to come to power. They are two very Catholic monarchs. They centralize power in Spain. They centralize tax collection. They become wealthy and powerful. And then the first thing they're going to do is the Reconquista. They're going to push out all of the Muslims out of Spain. And in fact, anyone that wasn't Catholic needed to leave or face the punishment of the Inquisition. And so once Spain then has become this heavily centralized, powerful Catholic state, they then are going to impose their religion on the rest of the world. They are going to look out to find converts. And that especially is what motivated Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, was finding new converts to be converted, of course, to Catholicism. Of course, another big reason and why they send out Christopher Columbus is they're looking for wealth, especially pearls and gold. And so Christopher Columbus is supposed to find his way over to Asia, and especially India. They're looking for India because of the told wealth, especially spices in India. And Christopher Columbus was supposed to sail to India and return with fabulous wealth for these two monarchs. Well, of course, luck would have it, he doesn't arrive in India. He sails to the west, the first explorer to do this. And instead, of course, he arrives in the Caribbean. He arrives in modern-day Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and he names this large island Hispaniola. And of course, he thinks that he has found India, and so he calls this India, and he calls these people the Indians. And so to this day, this area of the Caribbean is called the West Indies. Now, when he arrives in Hispaniola, he, of course, is going to meet the native people there, and the native people to the Caribbean are called the Taínos. Now, Columbus had promised Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand that he was going to bring back some riches, some gold, some pearls. And these Taínos are very simple people. They don't have gold. They don't have pearls. And in fact, they are largely living off the land. They don't believe so much in private ownership of property. They're very simple people that believe in animism. They believe in that each living thing has a spirit, and so that they don't need to interfere with the land or the environment as much as possible. And Columbus, of course, is very, very different. And Columbus is an imperialist. He arrives for the purpose of claiming this land for Spain and for claiming these people as converts to Catholicism. And so when he doesn't find lots of wealth like gold and pearls, he kidnaps 400 Taínos instead, puts them back on his caravels, and sails back to Spain to present them as slaves to Queen Isabella. Queen Isabella, when they arrive, is horrified by this, because she says these people are now Christians and should not be enslaved. And of course, commissions several more seafaring voyages back to the Americas to Christianize more Taínos. And this, of course, is going to start our mass colonization of the Americas. And the first two countries, as you can see on this map over here, are Spain and Portugal. These are the two countries that are going to start to colonize the Americas. They have the best ships. They're right next to each other, these caravels. And because of this, they start to claim all of the Americas for themselves, largely because many of the other countries, the powerful Western European countries, are very distracted. For instance, during the same time period that Spain and Portugal are colonizing the Americas, the English are fighting themselves. They're fighting that English Civil War because Charles I disbanded Parliament, etc. And because of this, the Spanish and the Portuguese got a good leap, a good head start on colonization in the Americas before the rest of Europe. But the problem is that they are two Catholic countries, and they're supposed to be very unfavorable terms with each other. But once they claim all these land in the Americas, they have these interlapping claims. Their claims interlap, and they find that they start competing for lands. And so they then turn to the only sovereign that commands both of them, which is the Pope. And so they come with a map showing the lands that they have discovered, and they say, Pope, please help us out. Can you help us determine which country gets which land? And so the Pope is going to draw a line right down the middle of the world map. And this is called the line of demarcation. The line of demarcation. And the Pope says all the lands to the west will go to Spain, all the lands to the east will go to Portugal. Now, of course, the irony is that it is not this line here, this darker line that the Pope first draws. It is instead this line here. He draws this very, very favorable line for Spain. And of course, at the time, most of North America is undiscovered, but good parts of Portugal and Central America and the Caribbean are discovered. And the reason that the Pope does this, the Pope is Spanish born. The Pope is favoring Spain here, but he's saying you have claims to this land here and to the claims of Western Africa and the Indian Ocean that you have already discovered. Well, the two nations meet and they decide this is a little bit unfair to Portugal. And so they do push the line over here. They say, thank you, Pope, but we are going to move this line over here. And this becomes the official line. And this becomes the Treaty of Tordesillas, where the Spanish get all land to the west and the Portuguese get all land to the east. And they are never supposed to come in and conquer lands already claimed by a Christian. Okay, and this, of course, is going to start our era of colonization. And in this era, all of our Western European nations, and when we talk about the major players in this particular era, there's really 5 major players, and that is the Spanish, the Portuguese, the English, the French, and the Dutch. Those 5 countries, all 5 of those countries are going to believe in this economic concept, mercantilism. Mercantilism is just so important in world history because it drives colonization unlike any other factor. Mercantilism is the belief that your country is only as powerful as how much gold and silver it has in its vaults. And there's a couple of ways to get gold and silver, one of which is physically coming over and taking gold and silver from the peoples in which you colonize. Famous examples, of course, are the Spanish conquistadors like Hernan Cortez with the Aztecs or Francisco Pizarro with the Inca. But another way in which that you could get gold and silver in your vaults is by establishing a favorable balance of trade, meaning you are exporting more than you are importing. If you are exporting more than you're importing, that means you are selling more than you're buying. And if you're selling because you are only purchasing things or selling things for gold and silver, you are bringing more gold and silver into your country than you are letting leave your country. And so that's an important concept. And it's also an important concept in describing why plantation agriculture emerges in the Americas. The thought process here is to use tobacco from the Chesapeake region of North America, modern-day Virginia and Maryland. These are British colonies. This tobacco is going to make its way over to England. Now, that's not gold. So how does that factor into mercantilism? Well, it factors into mercantilism because now the English merchants over in England are going to sell that tobacco to the rest of Europe. And they are going to demand that the rest of Europe pay in gold or silver. Therefore, mercantilism leads to the establishment of colonies. Those colonies send over raw materials like fur or lumber or tobacco, what have you, and then it is resold by the mother country in order to make wealth and especially gold and silver. Okay. The Spanish are also going to claim the Philippines, and they're going to hold the Philippines for 333 years. This is a colony that becomes very, very important to the Spanish. It's first discovered by Ferdinand Magellan, who erroneously is called the first man to circumnavigate the globe. He actually never made it. He was the captain, and his ships made it all the way around the globe. He himself died in the Philippines after he attempted to claim the Philippines for Spain. He put this big cross on the hill. He called everybody in the Philippines Catholic, and of course, they revolted and killed him. But the Spanish returned back to the Philippines. They conquered it by defeating the natives. And then this gave the Spanish access to a very, very important port at Manila. Manila becomes a very important trading center because Manila in the Philippines is the gateway to China. And China has still lots of wealth and the Chinese are trading for the Spanish silver, and they are trading gold, and they are trading silks and spices. And so this becomes a very important trade center, Manila, for the Spanish. Okay, our conquistadors. We have two very famous conquistadors of the Spanish that come in and plunder and take the wealth of the Native American societies. The first is the Aztecs and Hernan Cortez. The Aztecs are already very unpopular in Mesoamerica, modern day Mexico, because of all of the peoples that are being conquered by the Aztecs. The Aztecs, of course, believed that there needed to be ritual human sacrifices of human beings of tribute. And in order to conquer this tribute and have this tribute to be sacrificed to the gods, they were constantly conquering other nations, other states, other societies. But because there was so much conquering going on, the Aztecs had made lots of enemies. And Hernan Cortez learns this because he comes in and he is able to acquire a translator, Doña Marina, and she is able to tell Hernan Cortez of the weaknesses of the Aztecs. And so because of this, Hernan Cortez is going to ally with many Aztec enemies, and they march on the capital of Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan, perhaps still the biggest city in the world at this stage when the Spanish arrive. But the Spanish have some huge advantages, one of which, of course, is disease. Part of the Columbian exchange is that our Europeans are going to bring over the old world diseases such as smallpox, in which our indigenous peoples in the Americas have no immunity to. Smallpox, especially in the major cities. And of course, this is really sobering to talk about when we're talking about disease. Disease is going to be especially widespread in these tight, packed cities. And of course, Tenochtitlan, being this major city in the middle of a lake, is going to be hit hard by smallpox. The Aztecs are going to be very weakened by smallpox, and this is going to allow the Spanish, with their superior weapons, with guns, to come in and defeat the Aztecs. And the eventual thing that is going to completely have the Aztec Empire collapse is not going to be the Spanish. It's going to be the conquered peoples that the Aztecs had conquered. They finally are going to come in and completely overrun the Aztec Empire. Cortez himself is going to claim the Aztec Empire for the Spanish. He calls it New Spain. He destroys Tenochtitlan, and that is where Mexico City is created. The Inca, perhaps the biggest empire in the world before the Spanish arrive. And here comes another Spanish conquistador, Francisco Pizarro. He is going to trick the Inca into setting up a meeting with him. When this happens, they ambush the emperor Atahualpa. The Spanish then are going to demand that the Inca fill a room of gold for the safe return of their emperor. The Inca do this, and the Spanish still end up executing Atahualpa. Then the Spanish systematically move throughout the Inca Empire, and they actually do this very effectively because the Carpanon, this road that the Inca have throughout their entire empire, allows the Spanish to quickly land on the Pacific coast and then bring their soldiers all throughout the empire. Eventually conquer this huge empire, establish a new capital at Lima, and they're going to rule over this empire and get lots of gold out of it, especially with the use of the encomienda system. And the encomienda system is a labor system specifically to the Spanish. And it's going to satisfy, the Spanish had the belief of the 3 Gs. And the 3 Gs are gold, God, and glory. And we've seen this with our conquistadors, that they are going to realize all three, because the conquistadors are going to come in, they're going to claim this land, they're going to extract gold. And then the belief with this, the basis of this encomienda system, is that they are somehow doing the natives a favor because they are giving them Christianity in the process. And that's where the encomienda system comes in. Because what happens is that the encomienda system is supposed to be a give and take. Encomendar means to entrust. We are saying encomenderos, landowners, are given land by the Spanish crown. An encomendero, they get land, let's say it's in the former Inca Empire, let's say it's in Peru. This encomendero has been given, say, 100 acres of land. And of course, there's people living on that land. They're Inca natives living on that land. And so these natives now are entrusted to the encomendero. So you need to take care of these natives. You need to give them a good Christian education. And then in return, they will work for you and they will do whatever it is that you ask them to do to work the land. And this encomienda system, it's called, becomes slavery in the Americas, in which the Spanish are enslaving the natives to work for them to extract wealth from the land, whether it's agriculture or whether it's gold or silver. And of course, the result of this is because the natives have no immunity to the diseases coming over from the old world, are going to die in droves. Part of the San Comienda system is mining silver. There are two very, very prosperous silver mines in the new Spanish Empire, one of which was formerly the Aztecs, Zacatecas, which is in Mexico, now, of course, controlled by Spain, and the other one was Potosi in Peru. Both of these becomes thriving silver mines for the Spanish. Encomenderos are going to force their natives to work there in the encomienda system, and then they are going to take that silver. They're going to load them up onto the Spanish ships called galleons, which were heavily armored and defended, and then sail them either back to Spain or sail them over to the Philippines at Manila, where they can trade with the Spanish. With the Chinese. The Spanish also are going to transfer the Mita system. You might remember the Mita system in the Inca Empire was a system in which males were supposed to volunteer part of their year to public work projects. Well, the Spanish are going to come in and say, look, this system is already created. We're going to force these natives to instead work for us in these silver mines. Pretty nasty stuff going on. And because of the encomienda system especially, and because of this massive Spanish Empire that has now been controlled, the Spanish become the richest country in the world especially the 16th century, the 1500s. And Spain is going to set the example of how a Western European country can derive wealth from colonization. They are going to heavily use mercantilism to bring back all of these raw materials back to the capital. All of this silver that is mined in the Americas, merchants may keep that silver, but they have to pay a royal fifth, meaning they have to pay a 20% tax. All of that wealth comes back to the Spanish crown. And then once you have all of the silver flowing into Spain, the Spanish monarchs are going to put up tariffs, and tariffs are, of course, taxes on imported goods. And what they're essentially doing with this is they're saying, if other countries want to sell us goods, we are going to put a tax on that. And the thought process is, if we are taxing goods from other countries, that people in Spain aren't going to buy from other countries. They're going to buy domestic. They're going to buy from other Spanish sellers. And by doing this, it keeps that silver in the country. You buy domestic, you don't buy from, say, Portugal or England, and that keeps the wealth in the country. And Spain, of course, because of this, the wealthiest country in the world by the end of the 16th century. There's two ships in this era that we learn about, one of which are the caravels that aid in exploration, Portuguese ship, then adopted by the Spanish. The other are the galleons. The galleons are these heavily armed Spanish ships, and they are used primarily for moving this wealth, the gold and the silver. They're moving it especially from those silver mines, Zacatecas and Potosi, over to Manila in the Philippines, where they are trading with the Chinese. What are they trading for? They're trading for silk and spices and gold. China is their biggest consumer because they end up using silver as their major currency, starting during the Ming Dynasty and then used during the Qing Dynasty. And speaking of China, this is where China starts to fall behind Western Europe. China has been the most powerful country in the world, but after Zhang He's voyages, they are now in isolation. They are not colonizing, they are staying within China. And this is also the time period where when the Qing Dynasty comes around, where the Portuguese are going to start to arrive and try to get converts in China. Now, during the Ming Dynasty, which, as you guys know, is a very classic, very conservative Chinese dynasty, when Portuguese missionaries arrived, they were met as outsiders, as barbarians. But during the Qing Dynasty, which is a Manchu dynasty, it's different than the very proud classic Ming Dynasty. They were more welcome to outsiders, and because of this, hundreds of thousands of Chinese converted to Catholicism. So a little bit of a change there between the Ming and the Qing, and looking at converts and Christians. Okay, so if you look at this map right here, we're looking now at the modern day United States. And we see a competition over North America. North America is colonized later than Central and South America. Our Spanish came in, they landed in the Caribbean, they made their way over to Central America. Of course, the Portuguese down in Brazil. But finally, England and France, and to a much lesser extent, the Dutch, are going to get in on colonization of North America, modern day United States. And it's going to start, first of all of these countries are aware that North America is there. They know from Spanish and Portuguese maps, they know that there is land here. And all three, both the Dutch, the French, and the English, are looking for something called the Northwest Passage. And the Northwest Passage, we actually missed this during the year. So I want to make this clear. The Northwest Passage is a route through or around the Americas to Asia. It doesn't exist, but they're looking for it. They're looking for a route through or around the Americas to Asia. And this tells you how important that these Asian goods are at this time period. They're not looking to claim land. They're looking still to find a way to Asia. They're still trying to make a way over to those spices and that gold. But of course, they don't find Northwest Passage. Instead, they find lands that they can claim for their country. Jacques Cartier is going to discover Canada, claim Canada for France. Then Samuel de Champlain, the very famous French explorer, is going to sail down St. Lawrence River into Quebec, and Quebec becomes the capital, the trading post of this French empire. But understand, they are victims of their environment. The French, when they come in, are looking for, just as everybody else, they're looking for gold and silver and all these wonderful things. But Canada is snowy and cold, and they have not found any gold and silver. And in fact, the only thing of value there are beavers that can be used for furs, for fur trade. And fur, especially beaver fur, was becoming quite fashionable in France, and then later through the rest of Europe. And so the French are going to adapt to their environment, and they're going to say, okay, we're going to establish our colonies in the Americas based off of the fur trade. And so they are going to trade with the natives. They're going to have the best relationships with the natives for a couple of reasons. One, because they trade, and two, because they are having to follow the beaver. That means that they can't stay in one place for too long, because they stay in one place, they kill the beavers, all of the beavers in one place, sad. And then they can't stay there anymore because all the beavers are dead. They have to move further. And so when you look at this map here, you see the French territory. It's huge. They acquire a lot of land, but this is very, very sparsely populated. There's not a lot of people here because they're really just building temporary forts and then moving on. And this is going to drive them further and further throughout the continent. Of course, priests are going to arrive. They're going to try to convert natives to Catholicism. But by and large, our French have our best relations with the Native Americans. Okay, the English, very, very different case. The English, first of all, we have an explorer for the English, John Cabot, and he's going to make his way over and discover Newfoundland to the Chesapeake Bay. And the Chesapeake Bay becomes the first location for a successful English colonization, and that will be Jamestown. But of course, before we even see colonization, the English, with all their problems at home, with the Protestant Reformation and with the English Civil War, they didn't colonize for much longer, much later. Instead, they focused on piracy, and we had famous pirates like Sir Francis Drake that was coming in and stealing money from the Spanish galleons. Finally, however, the English get involved in colonization. And of course, the most important colonization when it comes to the foundation of the United States is Jamestown in 1607. This is our first successful English colony, and it is actually formed by a joint stock company. The irony in this is that the joint stock company, it is formed by adventurers, they call them, which becomes the basis of venture capitalists. These are people that are looking to derive a quick wealth. They're not looking to form a long-lasting colony. They're there to find gold and get out. That's what the London Company is all about. And so these people coming over on this first ship over to modern-day Virginia, they're looking to find gold and leave and bring back money for the London Company. That's what a joint stock company is. It's a business. And we know that these people weren't there to stay and to form a permanent colony because the first ship had exactly 100 people and every single one of them were men. So they're coming over, they're looking to find gold, and they're looking to get out. Well, the problem is that there's no gold available here in this swampy, malarial place in Virginia. And in fact, all these people are going to die had they not been helped by the local Powhatan Indians. They gave them some food, and then showed them how to cultivate tobacco. And it's not gold, of course, it is tobacco that becomes the cash crop in the Chesapeake region. And more and more people start to slowly trickle over to this Chesapeake region. This finally becomes a settler colony for the English when they realize there's not gold there, but there's plentiful land, and there's land for people to come over that are down on their luck or don't have land because of the primogeniture laws in England. And so people that are down on their luck and don't have land are going to turn to indentured servitude. And indentured servitude is used by the English to come in and get workers to work on these emerging tobacco plantations. Indentured servitude, as you guys probably remember, is people that are over in England. They're poor. They can't afford the trip over to the New World. And so they're going to say, we will work for free for 5 to 7 years for anyone who will pay for us to come over to the New World. And so it's a mutually beneficial relationship, because the planters in Virginia are going to say, okay, we need workers on our tobacco plantations. We will pay for indentured servants to come over to the New World, and then they will work for us for 5 to 7 years. And so the English are going to use this indentured servitude system, and it is going to work. However, we're going to see that there is going to start to be a more efficient and profitable method of laborers, and that, of course, will be chattel slavery once the Portuguese show how luxurious that can be. And then the group that everyone forgets about are the Dutch. And the Dutch are very successful colonizers in this era, but they're much more successful in the Indian Ocean. They're going to make a lot of money off of making wealth from Indian Ocean trade. And they are not going to be very successful in the Americas. And that's Henry Hudson is going to come over, and he's going to find the Hudson River, which of course is named after him here. And this is going to be the first Dutch New York. New York is claimed by the Dutch. They don't call it New York. They call it New Amsterdam, and is their major trading colony there. They are going to trade with the Native Americans, especially further. We're going to have some Chesapeake tobacco farmers. However, the British are going to come in. King Charles II promises this land to his brother, the Duke of York. And of course, the English steal this land from the Dutch, and they call it New York. Okay. With all of this interaction, we, of course, have the Columbian Exchange. And the first thing I want to point out, because many students often, if they mess up the Columbian Exchange, which is a very simple concept, you forget that the Columbian Exchange is between the Old World and the New World in its entirety. A lot of people think the Columbian Exchange, they think of Europe and the Americas. They forget that part of this Columbian Exchange is Africa and Asia as well. This is Afro-Eurasia and the Americas, and the widespread sharing of disease, plants, and animals. It has a tremendous amount of effects on the entire world, this Columbian Exchange, because we have these new animals, these new foodstuffs, agriculture, and new disease that is transferred from place to place. We need to know the biggest effects of the Columbian Exchange and a couple of things that were transferred. The biggest effect on the New World, without question, is disease. Especially smallpox and measles and malaria. But the big killer is smallpox because of the rats that are coming on these ships, as well as just the microbes in the boots of these explorers coming over to the New World. They bring with them these pathogens, and these pathogens are going to spread through North America very, very quickly because, again, of course, they have no immunity, being in isolation for thousands of years from the rest of the world. And so 50 to 90% of native populations are going to die. This is an unprecedented amount of death in world history as far as population. And those numbers, as high as 90%, are especially going to be in the very densely populated areas where disease spreads very quickly. However, there are some positive effects of the Columbian Exchange on the New World, and especially cattle, animals, pigs, cows being introduced to the Americas. The Americas didn't have any draft animals. They didn't have any animals that they could domesticate or cultivate with. This was a big change. They have pigs and cows. Now the American diet is going to feature much more meat and cheese. And then, of course, the big one is horses. There were no horses in the Americas before the Columbian Exchange. Horses are going to revolutionize transportation in the Americas, especially for the semi-nomadic tribes that are following groups like, for instance, the Sioux in the Great Plains that follow the buffalo. Horses are going to revolutionize their lifestyle and make it far easier to follow the buffalo. There also are changes from the New World to the Old World. And the biggest is that all these new crops that are highly caloric and easy to cultivate, and they're going to change the diets in Europe for the better. We're going to see potatoes, tomatoes, beans, tobacco, maize. Some of the big ones that students always forget, potatoes. Those are coming over from the Americas. There were no potatoes in Europe before the Columbian Exchange. And of course, it's going to revolutionize diets in places like Ireland, where they start to devote 90% of their entire diet to these crops coming over from the Americas. The biggest effect then of the Columbian Exchange on the Old World, on especially Europe, but also Africa and the rest of the world, is population growth. More people, the growth increasing. And the growth is so much so, we have these new crops that are coming in. Even Africa is going to increase in population, even though this is the same time period as the Atlantic slave trade, in which millions are taken from the continent. Still, the population increases because of all of the new foodstuffs in the time period. Okay, we're getting on to our last third of this lecture, which is talking about the first era of colonization at a glance. European nations have claimed the New World, and they have started to claim the Indian Ocean region, India and Southeast Asia. What do all of these places have in common? All of this colonization have in common. It's driven by political rivalries, religious converts, and mercantilism. Those are our biggest reasons why. Over in Asia and Africa, primarily the Portuguese followed by the Dutch, it's about taxing and controlling trade. Over here in the Americas, because the indigenous populations were less prepared to resist, we see lots of land ownership, and then we see these plantation agriculture developed, as well as the fur trade, especially with the French. We have new labor systems emerging in this time period. The Spanish are going to use the encomienda system. The English will use indentured servitude. We've talked about these. And then chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is significant because chattel slavery is the process of considering human beings to be property. And chattel slavery is especially unique because children of these slaves will continue to be considered property. This is going to this is not new in world history. African slave trade within Africa internally has existed all the way back before written history. However, we see far more widespread and far more just magnitude of slavery than ever before in world history with the Atlantic slave trade, which is first popularized again by the Portuguese. The Portuguese are first in a lot of things. And because they came down and colonized Western Africa first, with people like Vasco da Gama, we see that the first slave trade is controlled by the Portuguese. Da Gama set up trading posts along Africa's coast. They brought with them manufactured goods like gunpowder and guns and cannons. They're going to trade these weapons to West African kingdoms. These coastal kingdoms are going to take these weapons and then trade slaves. And this becomes a very, very nasty snowball effect where the slave trading kingdoms become the most heavily armed kingdoms because they have all of these manufactured weapons like guns and cannons. And then they realize we are getting so much wealth from doing this that we are going to engage in slave raids for the purpose of capturing slaves from other African kingdoms so that we can trade for more wealth from the Portuguese. It becomes a very, very nasty cycle where kingdoms like Dahomey become very powerful off of this slave raiding type of economy. Now, where are the Portuguese bringing all of these slaves to their plantations in Brazil? Brazil becomes the single most wealthy colony in the world because of its climate. It is perfect for sugarcane. And sugar, of course, is one of those crops that we talked about was the whole reason in which the age of exploration occurred, because we were looking for these spices, particularly sugar from Asia. Now you have this place because of the climate where sugar can be grown profitably. And so the Portuguese are going to arrive, and at first they are going to try to use something similar to the Spanish. They're going to try to use the encomienda system with the natives. this is not going to be successful because disease wipes out such a large part of their population. And so the Portuguese then are going to turn to West Africa and to slavery. And slavery in Brazil is some of the nastiest treatment of human beings in world history, because the working conditions on these slavery plantations were terrible, working from dusk till dawn. This is where the symbol of the whip becomes kind of the symbol of tyranny of the slaver to the slave. And the numbers of turnover on slaves in Brazil are terrible. 5 to 10% of all of the slaves in Brazil are going to die every year. And the reason being is because of disease, because of malnutrition. Slaves were not given enough to eat, and they were living in the slave quarters, where they were out in these poorly roofed plantation cabins where they would sleep on moth-eaten blankets. I mean, really, really nasty living conditions in a tropical environment where you've got heavy rainfall. I mean, just really, really nasty stuff. And 4.9 million slaves made their way to Brazil. This is about 40% of all of the slaves traded in the Atlantic slave trade. You can compare that to 6% to North America in its entirety, including the United States. So a tremendous more slaves coming to Brazil. Brazil is the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery. It's as late as 1888, because of how important slavery was to this area of the world. And this is the system that the Portuguese established. And because of all of this free labor for the Portuguese, this made a tremendous amount of wealth for the Portuguese. The Spanish called the Portuguese sugar plantations the enginos, the engines, because of how much money that they're bringing in. And this popularizes cash crop agriculture in places like North America, including the Caribbean, where lots of sugar is cultivated. The transatlantic slave trade, we've talked about it already. Lots of slaves coming over to South America, especially Brazil. Another big place where slaves are coming in is the Caribbean. The Caribbean is going to get far more slaves than the rest of North America. When we learn about the Atlantic slave trade as Americans, and rightfully so, we think about slavery in the United States, because the United States is one of the last countries in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery. But when you look at the pure amount of slaves going from place to place, far more came to places like South America, Central America, the Caribbean, than the United States. Why did Europeans turn to African labor? Why did they move away from Native Americans? Obviously, there was a huge demand for labor in general because of all of the new cash crop agriculture that had been introduced. Indigenous people, because of disease, often died or escaped because they had better knowledge of the terrain. Indentured servitude was a system that worked well for the English for a time period, but many of these people, thinking that they were going to have easy work over in the Americas, realized that they were not at all accustomed to hard agricultural work, and they eventually became free. They became free in 5 to 7 years, and so Europeans looked for a system where their labor would stay enslaved forever. And this, of course, is going to start the new most popular trade route in the world, which is called the Atlantic trading system, otherwise called the triangular trade. This, if we looked at the key themes, is where the major trade route in world history still is going to go through the Indian Ocean, but we now see an even more popular trade route, and that's in the Atlantic Ocean. Why is it called a triangular trade route? It is this name comes from Europeans, and thus they consider the first leg from their home area of the world, Western Europe, to Africa. The first leg is going to go from Western Europe to Western Africa. They're going to bring with them manufactured goods that were taken from raw materials and made into something. For instance, textiles, firearms, rum. Rum was made from sugar, and so therefore it's a manufactured good. They're bringing these things over to Western Africa. They're trading them to the West African kingdoms for slaves. They're taking these slaves and bringing them to where the slave labor is being used in the agricultural plantations of South America, the Caribbean, or in North America, and then everything happens all over again. Taking from these Americans, they're bringing the raw materials, they're bringing tobacco, they're bringing sugar back to Europe, and it's one big cycle. And merchants are making a tremendous profit in each stop of this triangular trade. Okay. Of course, with this trade, you're bringing in lots of Africans into places they've never been before, coming into the Americans, into the Americas. This is called the African diaspora. We've talked about many diasporas in this class. The African diaspora is going to bring in millions of Africans over into all parts of the Americas. Usually, this would bring in a high influx of a specific type of language. Not the case with our African diaspora, because these West African kingdoms literally all spoke different languages. Almost every single one spoke some type of different language, and because of this, we have all these hundreds of different languages. Many slaves, even on these ships coming across the Middle Passage. Couldn't communicate, and largely slavers would try and mix up the populations, and so that they could not communicate with each other, unless would be more likely to orchestrate a successful rebellion. So now we have these slaves coming over to the Americas. They were intentionally separated, and then once they arrived, many of them didn't speak the same language here in the New World, and so whatever language they spoke often disappeared. And so many West African languages kind of came together as many slaves tried to communicate with each other, and then morphed with the language of whoever it is that's colonizing them. We have these syncretic languages that then emerge, which are a mixture of West African languages and then the language of their colonizer, whether it's English or Spanish or Portuguese. So we have all of these new languages that are created that are in some way mixtures of West African languages and English, Spanish, Portuguese, etc. These all together are called Creole. These are all these mixtures of syncretic languages. Um, okay. How about the impacts of the slave trade in Africa? African coastal leaders at first believed that this slave trade was going to bring them lots of wealth and success. And in fact, it did bring them lots of wealth at first, because there was, of course, slavery and slave trade in Africa centuries before the Atlantic slave trade. But people that were traded were prisoners of war, criminals, lower ends of society. However, when slave trading became so successful, that's when slavers started breaking the laws of these West African kingdoms and start coming in and capturing people that were not, in fact, meant to be traded by the kingdom's laws. One example is King Afonso of Congo. King Afonso of Congo originally allowed the Portuguese to come in and trade for his prisoners of war and his criminals, but he lost control of the slave trade in his kingdom. Slavers came in and took more and more people. And finally, he saw his own authority undermined in his kingdom. And this is a letter that he wrote to the King of Portugal, where he said, "Merchants are taking every day our natives, sons of the land, and sons of our noblemen, and vassals of our relatives, because the thieves and men of bad conscience grab them, wishing to have the things and wares of this kingdom." And so things have gotten out of control in Congo. And largely before they were traded, they were held in the slave castles, also called barracoons, where they would stay for days or even weeks before the merchant ships arrived to take them to the Americas. And their routes, leaving from these barracoons, is one of the worst aspects of world history, something called the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage, it says 6 weeks there, but often it could be as high as 12 weeks, was the journey across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. On average, 1/4 died on the trip because of the horrific conditions in which they're traveling in. They're largely held in the cargo portion of the ship, and these human beings were enchained to each other. Oftentimes, it was the right leg of one slave chained to the left leg of another. And because they were held in the cargo portion of the ship, they couldn't stand. They were inside on these rocky waters coming into the Caribbean, where the heat got into the 100s. One meal a day, one giving of water a day. And the conditions were so bad, disease spread quickly. There's nowhere to use the bathroom. It smelled terrible. I mean, this is the conditions that these Atlantic slaves had to travel, absolutely terrible conditions. And because of this, there was often slave revolts against the slavers. Most of them were unsuccessful, but one of them was successful, which was a Spanish ship called the Amistad, which was in 1839, so quite late in slave trade. In fact, And in fact, in 1839, the international slave trade had already been banned. It was actually banned in 1807. And the slaves took control of the ship. They killed the captain. The first mate said he was returning them to Africa, instead landed in the United States. And so the United States then took sovereignty over the ship and said, we need to determine what happens to the fate of these peoples. It made its way into the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said the international slave trade is banned, and thus these people are free. They are free peoples. And so this was, in fact, a successful slave revolt in the history of the Atlantic slave trade. Of course, there are many effects that the slave trade had on Africa and the peoples that were involved, of course, tearing families apart, psychological trauma, of course, and also the fact that most slaves that were taken, especially from West Africa, were men. They were men because they were going to be taken to work in the plantation agriculture of the Americas, and men were seen as better workers in this case. But because of this, it created a big gender distribution imbalance. There are far more women now in Western Africa than men. And because of this, we saw a rise of polygamy, because out of necessity, women could not find a available husband. And so because of this, we saw men taking more than one wife out of necessity. And also women were forced to step into what at the time in Africa was considered more traditional men's jobs, which again shows Africa being much more egalitarian in its societies than places in Europe. We already talked about the slave trading kingdoms like Dahomey and Oyo, which became very rich off of the slave raids and the triangular trade, who would trade their slaves for more firearms and thus only be more embedded in the slave raiding culture. The other thing is that because these kingdoms got all of their manufactured goods from Europe, they had no need then to establish their own manufacturing themselves. And this is going to delay industrialization in Africa. Our next time period, our European economies are going to become industrialized, and Africa is not. They're going to be slower in this process, and that's going to set the stage for European imperialism. Our Creole languages, obviously, effects of the slave trade because of the African diaspora. There are some places today where Creole languages are still spoken. In North America, it's far more rare because only 6% of the slaves came to North America, so you would think that they would not exist at all. However, even in the United States, there are Creole languages spoken. The one example of this is Gullah, which is spoken off of the coast of the Carolinas, where 75% of the population there at one point were slaves, especially for the cotton plantations in South Carolina. And then our last slide, the African diaspora does, of course, bring a diffusion of African culture. One of the big ones is music. African music is absolutely the root of most, if not all, of the popular genres that exist in the United States and around the world today, because of the rhythm instruments and the stringed instruments that the Africans brought over. They are going to influence the musical styles of gospel and blues and jazz and rock and roll and hip hop and rap and reggae and country music. All of these things can trace their ties to African culture. And then they bring their food with them. The rice cultivation, very popular in Africa, brought over to the Americas, and then influencing things like gumbo, and especially popular in places where there was high African populations, especially down in the south of the United States. Okay, here is your partnered Unit 4 SAQ. Identify one reason why the Portuguese Maritime Empire in the Indian Ocean was different than the Spanish Empire established in the Americas. One new labor system that emerged as a result of European colonization, and then one specific effect that the Atlantic slave trade had on either Africans brought to the Americas or on societies in Western Africa itself. All right, guys. I know this stuff is now closer to, it's more recent than things we've been going over earlier in this review, so I'm hoping that this stuff is relatively familiar to you guys. Watch this closely, study it, answer the questions, and then you guys will be looking at part 2 coming up soon. All right, guys. Hope you guys have a wonderful, having a wonderful weekend, and I will talk to you guys very soon.